discuss his extension, the news on the coaching staff, and what we heard yesterday with Mike McIntyre, the Winnipeg Free Press. Mike, holy smokes, I get back to town. I get off the plane yesterday and just check social media afterwards. And I think we knew it was going to be an interesting end-of-year address from a number of players, but holy smokes. First off, let's just get right to it. You were in the room. What was your reaction, and what was the reaction of the collective scribes around as you heard Mark Scheifele finish off with the comments that we played earlier today?
Well, as soon as Mark Scheifele left the room, a bunch of us turned to each other to kind of confirm with each other that we'd all heard what we thought we'd heard. It's one of those where maybe he misspoke, or maybe you heard it slightly differently. But no, we very quickly kind of all confirmed that Mark Scheifele did say what we kind of thought he said. And that will go down as perhaps the most surreal, garbage bag day interview we've seen. And Mark Scheifele's been involved in a couple of them. Who can forget the one after the 2019 first round elimination to the Blues? You'll recall that was the day that Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler were at the podium together, and Mark Scheifele barely said a word, and the body language was quite troubling that day, and a lot of folks were reading into what that might have been about. This time, Mark Scheifele didn't give us the silent treatment. He had a lot to say, but what he said certainly raised eyebrows. I imagine us not just here amongst us who follow this team. I got to think, the bombshells, the grenades that he launched would have reverberated around the entire NHL. And I suspect there were 31 other general managers who were quite interested to hear what Mark Scheifele said, because, well, he didn't flat out come out and demand a trade. That sure sounded like a trade request, a public trade request to me. Mark Scheifele spoke like a guy who is an unrestricted free agent this summer, free to go to the highest bidder, not like a guy who is under 2 more years of contract. And I think that's why a lot of us were rather puzzled by the language he used and just the tone of that whole news conference, because he certainly sounded like he has one foot out the door and is anxious to get the second one there as well.
Well, Mike, and I said this off the bat, and I'm sure we've heard this repeated ad nauseum by folks, on their Twitter feeds or whatever after they saw this. If you had brought someone from outside and just said, hey, here are 2 players speaking at the end of the season, one guy's an unrestricted free agent, one guy's got 2 years left, would any of them have thought that, oh, Mark Scheifele's the guy with 2 years on the contract? The contrast between what Paul Stastny said on a question asked to Blake Wheeler,
right,
and what said Mark Scheifele was stunning. And I think it just speaks to what we've talked about on this program for a long time. It's quite obvious that all was not right within that dressing room, within that leadership core, and it was in all caps right in our face yesterday afternoon.
It was, and Mark Scheifele has taken criticism, and I would say in some ways he's been labeled as a bit of a selfish hockey player, because of the fact that what he's capable of, and there's so much more there, and he leaves you wanting, I think, so many nights. Yeah, the points are great, but it's his play in his own end and on the other side of the puck that, I think speaks volumes about why this team remains kind of stuck where they are. And, Mark Scheifele didn't exactly come out and pour cold water on the notion that he's a selfish player. He came out and talked entirely about himself. I've got to do what's best for me. I have to talk to my agent. I have to talk to my family. He made it sound, Huss, these year-end interviews with the GM are about the GM kind of, debriefing with the player. He made it sound like Kevin Cheveldayoff has an appointment with him to discuss, what Mark Scheifele feels needs to be done here when it comes to both himself and the organization. It was just, the whole thing was very odd. I'll say this. I guess good on Mark Scheifele for not hiding behind cliches or canned answers. Like, he came out and certainly spoke what was on his mind. And I got to think that was pretty calculated on his part. Like, he had to know. He's a smart guy. He's a student of the game. He had to know in a hockey mad market like Winnipeg that those words were going to be amplified and dissected. And I imagine that's exactly what his intention was. I asked Kevin Cheveldayoff flat out this morning, or when he spoke to us a couple hours ago at noon, has Mark Scheifele asked for a trade? And Kevin Cheveldayoff said no, but it is interesting to note, Huss, and I imagine this was calculated as well, that Kevin Cheveldayoff met with us before he sat down with Mark Scheifele, not after. And that's probably a good thing from the GM's perspective. There's a legal term out there called plausible deniability. And so Kevin Cheveldayoff, if he had met with us after he just debriefed with Mark Scheifele, there's probably some things that he would have either had to flat out lie or deflect. In today's case, he could sort of just say, well, I haven't talked to him yet, so I guess I'll find out what that's all about. And of course, we're not going to get Kevin Cheveldayoff like tomorrow. It would be fascinating if we could kind of get him after the Scheifele interview. But I got to think that conversation with Mark Scheifele is going to be one for the ages.
Well, no doubt about it. And a couple of things on that, Mike. I'm not sure whether he clarified whether the agent had asked for a trade. I mean, I'm not sure whether Mark Scheifele said anything in particular.
True.
And again, I mean, there's a few better in the business of tiptoeing around something than Kevin Cheveldayoff. So we certainly won't rule that out. But I'm with you, and I said this at the beginning of the show. I mean, that was a guy that said, how do you ask for a trade without directly going out and say, I want to be traded? You do what you did yesterday. And to be honest, Mike, before we even got to the bomb at the end of his media availability, the comments from the first couple of questions about how I'm in the prime of my career, I like where my game's at, all of that stuff, to me, that was not a message to anyone here in Winnipeg. That was to 31 other general managers saying, hey, I've still got a lot in me. I obviously need a change of scenery, and I may be good for the team. I mean, it was essentially a sales pitch for his services elsewhere in the league.
It was. And again, contrast that with what we've seen from a lot of players over the last week coming out and talking about the need for looking in the mirror, for, self-improvement, self-growth, for sort of hard reflection.
How about some self-awareness, Mike?
Right. And there just wasn't a whole lot of that. And, the Scheifele interview alone would be concerning enough. But then, another shoe sort of fell when Dave Lowry met with us a few minutes after Mark Scheifele. And Huss, you probably picked up on this, but Dave Lowry said Mark Scheifele has a decision to make. And I wish one of us were able to follow up on what he meant by a decision, because again, he is not a unrestricted free agent. He's not a restricted free agent. What decision does he have to make, unless he's talking about, does he decide to not show up to camp and violate his contract? I mean, or is he talking about he has a decision as to whether he wants to commit to playing a better all-around game? Or is that in reference to he has a decision to make as to whether he wants to ask the organization to move him? I don't know. I'm not going to put words in Dave Lowry's mouth. But again, the fact that he's talking about a decision that Mark Scheifele has to make, Mark Scheifele has no power right now. So I found that a curious bit of phrasing. And it only kind of adds to the overall intrigue of the whole situation. You
know what? We didn't get a chance. Remo, if you can, pull up 27, because that is the comment. We did want to get to it. We spent a lot of time talking and hearing from Stastny and Wheeler and, of course, Mark Scheifele. This is the comment that Mike was talking about. Dave Lowry, was, he spoke about the end of the season and whatnot, but in specifically the final answer from Dave Lowry was quite clearly a little bit more of an open door into what had been happening behind the scenes. This is how it sounded yesterday.
I think the biggest thing coming out of what Mark said is that he's going to have his meeting. He's going to have to go through the process, and then he's going to have to make a decision. that is, that's something that I'm not going to control.
Mike, I mean, there it is for folks that missed it before. That is a comment. And again, we can't just listen to that without thinking about what we've heard from Mark Scheifele's teammates over the past couple of weeks.
Right.
Kyle Connor talking about building a culture. Paul Stastny and Nikolai Ehlers talking about buying into the team. I mean, there's a number of decisions. Do you want to be here? But regardless, I think the question that they've been asking that I don't think they got the answer is, do you want to be part of the solution, or are you going to be part of a problem? Because make no mistake about it, you can be the most talented player in the world. If you're doing your own thing and not buying into your team in a team sport, you know what you get? You get a disappointing season and you fall short of your goals. And guess where we are right now, Mike?
Well, for sure. And that's where, to me, Huss, it would have been fascinating, wouldn't it, if they'd switched up the partners yesterday? Like Mark Scheifele came out with Adam Lowry, Paul Stastny came out with Blake Wheeler. It would have been fascinating to watch the dynamic if Mark Scheifele had come out with Paul Stastny, who I imagine we might have got one of those side eyes there. And, I think you played this clip. I didn't catch it earlier, but where Stastny basically interrupts the captain and flat out says, I'm going to jump in here. And then
let me take this one, Blake.
Yeah, we've got to be held accountable, whether it's player on player. We've got to have more respect for each other. When you don't have that, when you don't care about the teammate next to you, and you just care about what you're doing or certain individual things, that starts bleeding into the game. By process of elimination, it's pretty clear who Paul Stastny was talking about. And as I say, it would have been something else if him and Scheifele had come out together. And again, it really adds to this overall feeling, Huss, of dysfunction right now within this organization. Like I'm not going to suggest it's at the Vegas Golden Knights level, but there's a lot of dysfunction right now, whether it's players publicly pointing fingers or kind of speaking in code. Mark Scheifele, what he did. I mean, the coaching staff, now we find out, kind of twisting in the wind, like they're not being brought back, but they're free to apply for their old jobs. And then, of course, Kevin Cheveldayoff getting the 3-year extension. Like this is, I'll put it this way, the most important offseason in franchise history is off to one hell of a turbulent start.
We'll get to the coaching staff and the Chevy extension in a minute. But back to the Stastny comments. That might be, and I mean, we've been talking for weeks about how open and somewhat damning on, what has been happening with this team for a long time. That, Mike, is the soundbite that I think probably needed to be said the most, and probably needed to be said from Paul Maurice way before he ended up leaving. And, for it to continue to fester to get to this point, I think is a real failure on the organization's part. And, Kevin Cheveldayoff certainly involved in that. And I think it also speaks to the the situation that Dave Lowry was put in, where, like, what are you going to do? You're an interim head coach and you're going to go all ranking and start being Tortorella. I mean, I don't think that was realistic. And I think they knew they were trying to hold things together as best as they could. But I mean, so obviously this was broken. This is something that I got a ton of feedback on my tweet yesterday. I mean, I said I wasn't surprised at all about these comments. Maybe the frankness of it, but the way that Scheifele came out, I mean, I think that was just, it was an open window to something that had seemingly gone rotten a long time ago, which is stunning. I mean, if you had told me this 4 years ago, that we'd be at this point, still with 2 years left in the deal, and, we'd be looking at Mark Scheifele as the guy that was most likely out, and frankly, to his own interest, has 1 foot out the door, I would have said, no way. I mean, this is all being built on, but it's obviously something's gone rotten. Assuming you agree with that, when did this happen? When did this start? I mean, I look back to the second half of the 2018-19 season, And I'm not sure. At times it looked like maybe things had gotten better, but I mean, you get into the COVID year, then last year with the Canadian division. I mean, the last 2 years, it's almost like it just kicked the can down the road. And this is the reckoning that has been long overdue for this hockey team for a very long time. From your perspective, where did this begin to go wrong?
Well, you're right. And you look at the different cracks, after that magical run in the spring of 2018, which seems like a lifetime ago. And who can forget what Mark Scheifele did in that second round against National? He was the best. He was the best player in the National Hockey League. And, it looked like the sky was the limit for him and for his team. And you're right, Huss. I mean, we know that this team really took a 180 around the midway point of the following season. And, it led to closed door meetings and ruffled feathers and all that. And then, of course, Dustin Byfuglien isn't back. Brian Little, who I think really helped hold a lot of things together, probably behind the scenes. Brian Little, I've referred to him, and I know others have as well, as a bit of the conscience of this organization. And I think Brian Little being gone probably caused some other issues that maybe had been managed to start to fester within the room. Of course, Patrick Laine, we know what happened there, and reports of dynamic between young players and older players. And I think we saw a guy like Mark Scheifele, a guy, a sort of happy-go-lucky, carefree type who, just loved the game. We saw him change to a little more of a serious, reserved, sometimes angry individual. And we saw that manifest itself, of course, last year in that second round playoff series, and the absolute head scratcher against, Montreal that really cost himself and his team that series. But even go back to the bubble, and, he gets hurt by Matthew Tkachuk, like pretty much first shift of game one against Calgary. And I got to think that probably led to some anger, from Mark Scheifele. Like, I just think his personality changed, and a psychologist could probably have a field day analyzing not just Mark Scheifele's sort of evolution, but the whole team here. And, again, we've seen it, as you say, in bits and pieces. Paul Maurice just flat out resigns, like out of the blue. Like, what caused that? And, we may never know the full story behind that, just as we may never know the full story behind Dustin Byfuglien. But it's clear that the culture that this organization talked about, how important it is, and what they were trying to establish, that didn't get built overnight. It also didn't crumble overnight, but it's clear that they are going in the wrong direction, and they have much work to do to start to repair it.
We'll look ahead to, this offseason, in particular, the Scheifele situation for Kevin Cheveldayoff, but we have to mention, and I know Ken broke it, you confirmed it yesterday, that Chevy has a 3-year extension. Some fans not pleased with this. Others that believe that, when you look at the drafting and most of the trades that Cheveldayoff's made, you can make the case that he hasn't done a bad job. But the fact of the matter is, this was all on his watch. And were you surprised that he's back? Are you surprised that it's a 3-year deal? And like me, do you agree that that deal was probably in a drawer for a while and was put out or kind of floated out at this time just to say, listen, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but it's a non-starter. Kevin Cheveldayoff is the guy that's calling these shots going forward.
I'm not surprised for a couple of reasons. We know the loyalty of True North. It's one of their hallmarks. And I also believe, Huss, you and I have talked about this in the past, that ownership here in Winnipeg, they're a little more hands-on, a little more directly involved than maybe you would get in some other markets. And again, the Jets don't have that buffer between the GM and the owner. Like, there's no director of hockey ops, there's no Jim Rutherford or Brendan Shanahan, or you could go down the list. So I think, Kevin Cheveldayoff, yeah, he certainly got the power as the GM, but I think he also has the trust and the ear of ownership, and it's a two-way street. So in a lot of ways, I guess giving up on Kevin Cheveldayoff would probably almost be seen as an indictment of ownership itself, right? He was their handpicked guy. And you're right, you can certainly rattle off all sorts of things, successes, whether it's on the drafting and developing side to the retaining of core pieces, you know, the Hellebucks and the Morrisseys and the Connors and the Ehlers and even the Scheifele's, like, to really good team-friendly contracts. So I think all of that probably earns Kevin Cheveldayoff another look, not to mention, like, he's likely going to be on his fourth different coach under his regime. But what he's going to now do this offseason, he hasn't really had the chance to do yet. He kind of inherited Claude Noel, because that was the true north choice, obviously, carry over from the Moose. You know, the Paul Maurice change was done mid-season. There wasn't an exhaustive coaching search, and I think history would suggest that Paul Maurice worked out pretty well for what this team, you know, started to build. And then, of course, Dave Lowry was an out-of-the-blue kind of mid-season audible that had to be called. So, yeah, he's probably going to have a fourth head coach now under his watch, but this will really be the first time he can do an exhaustive off-season search. And he's also going to be bringing in, it would appear, an entire new staff, save for Wade Flaherty. So I think they're going to give him, you know, another shot, and in this case, 3 years. That's the window. It's 1 year beyond, you know, the Wheeler window, if you want to call it, and I guess the Scheifele window now, which could close a lot quicker than 2 years from now. So no, I'm not entirely surprised. That being said, True North couldn't just send the message to the fan base that we're going to do nothing. And that's why I think you're seeing what's happened with the coaching staff here. They've got to send the signal to the fans that they are serious about, you know, not just the status quo, same old. And so I think we're going to see, you know, dramatic changes certainly behind the bench, and we may see dramatic changes when it comes to the on-ice product as well.
Well, and let's get to the coaching staff today. I mean, the reports out from Frank Saravelli and Elliot Friedman, and, you know, confirmed by Kevin Cheveldayoff in his availability today, that you know, a full search for a coach and coaching staff. And I think that is something that is incredibly important, because I was thinking about this morning. It is somewhat incredible that Paul Maurice came in when he did, and with the issues that they'd had in other areas, still maintained that same coaching staff all along. Because right. I would have thought if there was one guy that would have had the power to make those changes,
yeah,
Paul Maurice would have been the guy, and that never happened. And that's something I'll always wonder, because it would have bought them time, to be honest with you. I mean, some of the times where he was under the most heat with the performance of the club, even this year, you know, I think that would have placated people for a little while and potentially could have improved the team, but that never happened. But it is significant to know that not only will there be a full search for a head coach candidate, but that person will be able to come in, with the exception of Wade Flaherty, and that makes a lot of sense because goalies are sort of in their own
They're
little
unicorns.
world. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's all led to this. I think it was the logical choice. I'm not sure everyone believed that it would happen, but the fact that, you know, this is today, the day after the season, these reports coming out and confirmed by Kevin Cheveldayoff, I think speak to going forward. And as far as, you know, listen, I think they're just doing what they would normally do, not saying, hey, you know, everyone's fired, but, you know, we're moving on. They've got the opportunity to employ. But that decision, in addition, personnel-wise, to what you're doing with Mark Scheifele, and assuming, I think many of us agree, myself, I've been talking about this for a while, that I think the Jets realized for a while that they needed to get out of the Mark Scheifele business. And to be honest, it's also the one move that has the potential to bring back a real significant return. But this decision on the coaching staff going forward, and how they come to that, who they interview, who they consider, whether it's just guys that they know, if you will, or a real legitimate exhaustive move that could take a while, I think is important. And this also speaks to the timing of, you know, this extension with Kevin Cheveldayoff, whether it be announced, whether it was signed earlier or not. To fire the general manager right now, I mean, you basically can't do that. If they knew that they were going to move on from Chevy, they needed to do that a few months ago, like many other teams that weren't making the playoffs have done, so they don't get into this point, and then you're starting that biggest rock with everything else to come after that, considering the importance of these next few months for this organization.
Yeah, and again, to go back to something Paul Stastny said yesterday, Huss, that I found really interesting, you'll note he spoke of other coaching staffs around the league, and he specifically singled out two different staffs, one of which was a guy that the Jets probably might have had some interest in, except they were too late, if you will, on the Bruce Boudreau front. And, Stastny gave an example of Bruce Boudreau calling out a player after a rough game and why he feels that is something coaches need to do and how he believes it worked to the advantage of the player and the team. He then, of course, talked about the Calgary Flames and Daryl Sutter. And I do get the sense, and we've certainly heard this recently around the Jets, Huss, there's a belief, I think, that this was a better group than what they achieved on the ice, and that with a different voice, and Dave Lowry was a different voice, but he wasn't the different voice, that the Calgary model, if you will, of what the Flames were able to do this season compared to last, that is something that this Jets organization is going to take a look at. And that's not to say they're not going to make any changes. I mean, the Flames did make some changes. They lost their captain in the expansion draft, of course, and they brought in some players, but they didn't blow it all up. And here they are now, with a lot of the same core intact, the second best team in the Western Conference and a legitimate Stanley Cup favorite. So I get the sense that the Calgary model is something that True North is looking to as proof that we don't have to go nuclear here. We think we still got the makings of a really good team. Yes, we're going to have to make some changes. Some of them we may have to make that we weren't even planning, aka Mark Scheifele. But as you say, a Mark Scheifele trade would certainly fetch an impressive return. And the Jets would not be trading Mark Scheifele for futures. They'd be trading Mark Scheifele for contributing core player or players that can help now. And so, I don't get the sense that they believe their window is shut. They took a big step back this year, but, Kevin Cheveldayoff today said he expects they're going to spend to the cap ceiling again next year. And that would seem to indicate that they realize that in this market, and certainly, with the fans and the situation the way it is, they have to remain competitive, and they're going to do everything possible to get right back there.
Mike, let me ask you about Blake Wheeler's situation right now.
Mm-hmm.
I expect him to be back. I'll say that right off the bat. I mean, part of it is the fact that he's got a full no move at his age and what he's making for the next couple seasons. I think that is not an easy contract to move out, even if you had the willingness of the player to do that.
Right.
It was a very interesting contrast between he and Paul Stastny standing next to it, when it was some of the things that Blake didn't say and some of the things that Paul did say. But we can't be having this conversation, especially involving Mark Scheifele, without acknowledging how joined to the hip for so long, 26 and 55 has sort of been, those are the guys that run this team and then everybody else. It's sort of been interesting to see the way he and Paul Stastny and Nikolai Ehlers have clicked. And even Blake said yesterday, it's sort of too bad that it's over. I wouldn't have mind getting this going. Yeah. It seemed like there has been a real separation of those two. And, you made comments as to, they were always the ones that were going out as the leaders that were meeting the media together. That didn't happen yesterday, and that hadn't happened over the last few months. Where does this leave Blake Wheeler, in your opinion, right now, considering there's, in all likelihood, a new full coaching staff going forward? Right. And I think the acknowledgement that it is time for a number of the young players that have had accountability, that have been saying the things that needed to be said, needed to be moving into those roles. Where do the Jets go with here, and what is Blake Wheeler's role in being part of the solution if he is?
Well, you're right, Huss. I mean, breaking up Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler, which Dave Lowry did, and playing them on separate lines, like I thought in a lot of ways, we saw a rejuvenated Blake Wheeler down the stretch. And it's not just the points, and, he scored a bunch of goals here at the end of the year to kind of finish strong on a personal level. I just saw a guy with a lot more jump. I saw a guy the last couple times that he met with the media, I detected a bit of a shift that Blake Wheeler seemed, I don't want to say that there was a weight off his shoulder, but I felt like there was a bit of a lighter tone and a guy who, a little more reflective, a little more engaging, a little more personable than maybe what we'd seen, in the past. And I don't want to say that's just because him and Mark Scheifele, weren't on the same line anymore. I'm sure it's a lot more complex than that. But that being said, I did see a guy in Blake Wheeler who, found a role that's maybe a little bit different than the one he'd had and was really enjoying it. And so, I think there's still, look, he was still almost a point a game player. He can still do some things that I think are very valuable to the Jets. It's going to be obviously on a new coach to find a way to utilize Blake Wheeler to the best of his diminishing skill set because of his advancing age. But, I think, and Kevin Cheveldayoff referred to it as a legacy deal today. I thought that was an interesting term. He talked about some of the legacy deals that the Jets have handed out. Well, they've got out of a couple of them, like Dustin Byfuglien, Brian Little's, quote, legacy deals are a thing of the past, not because of anything the Jets really did. But Blake Wheeler's, for better or worse, I think they're stuck with it for these next 2 years. Is he going to produce like an $8+ million player? No. But I think everybody recognized when he signed the deal and why the team felt it was important to get Blake Wheeler under contract, coming off that impressive run that they had and the belief that even better things were around the corner. I don't think anybody can really hold that against the Jets. So now it's a matter of building around him. He's not the central piece. He shouldn't be playing, top line minutes anymore. But I think there's still a very useful player there. And it's going to be on the new coach to obviously, connect with the captain, assuming he remains captain. And I don't know if that's a guarantee. Like maybe Blake Wheeler would actually prefer to not carry the burden of being the captain. There's other guys in the NHL. Dustin Brown, I remember when he had it removed, he actually spoke of how he felt a huge weight off his shoulders, and that was in Los Angeles, hardly the hockey mad community that Winnipeg is. So, I suspect a leadership review will be among the many things on Kevin Cheveldayoff's to-do list. I wouldn't expect to see Blake Wheeler not still wearing the C in the fall, but I think a reduced role, one that certainly taps into the skills that he still has, could serve this team well in the long run. And if you're Blake Wheeler, this is not the time to be selfish or to put you before team. Not that he does that. I think if anything, Blake Wheeler recognizes that time really is running out on his career and on this team's kind of window. And I would think Blake Wheeler would be at the front of the line to embrace change if it meant success, because really that's all that should matter. There isn't a whole lot more next year's for Blake Wheeler. The time is now.
You know what? It's funny you say that, Mike, because I think what we're seeing in front of our faces with, the comments over the last couple of weeks of players, and particularly what happened with Mark Scheifele, I kind of think that this has been accepted in that dressing room for a while now, that there were going to be some big changes.
Right.
That moving on from it being Wheeler and Scheifele and everybody else, that those times are over. We look at where that's got them. That younger players that are significant contributors right now have moved into leadership roles naturally and are ready to do that. And like I said before, I think we've seen sort of a splitting of it being, 55 and 26 and then everyone else. And I think Blake sort of got that earlier. And listen, he's not going to go and kill. Obviously he didn't. I mean, he just sort of didn't really say very much and allowed Paul Stastny to go in and say many of the things that he needed to say. But I do think that Blake Wheeler can be part of moving forward and part of the solution. But I do think, to your point, I think it's important that it is in, and I'm not necessarily even going to say a different role, because I think whoever the coach is going to come in, he's going to have a clean slate, and he'll look at the players that he has and try and put the roster together and compile it the way it gives them the best chance to win.
Right.
But from a leadership perspective, for it being like, this is, Paul Maurice always said, this is Blake's team. They need to make everyone feel like it is their team. It cannot be all about that. And I think Wheeler's sort of gotten that. And I think we've seen that over the last couple of months, at least. Even despite, the back and forth that he had with Hamilton beforehand. I think that was a lot of the pressure of what was happening inside the room that maybe wasn't clearly obvious to everybody else, manifesting itself in a guy that had a lot on his shoulders. Whether or not he wears the C next year, I think that actually will be up for discussion, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that he could come in a different role like that and still be an effective player for the Winnipeg Jets. And, I think that will be very important, because even if you do make those changes, to have a buy-in of a guy like that, I think will say a lot to the rest of the guys in the room, that they are all on the same page once you kind of move on from some of the guys that they've been talking about that, to use Paul Stastny's quote, haven't respected their teammates and the other guys in the room, which is about as damning an indictment as I could possibly say about a player in a team sport like the National Hockey League.
It is. And again, if they're speaking this way publicly, as many players have, imagine what's being said privately. And again, like, I would have paid.
And that doesn't happen overnight, by the way, Mike. I think that's why we've seen what's happened with this season. We've heard these comments before. Now it's just sort of coming out. And to be honest, it's been glaringly obvious to anyone that pays close attention to this team on and off the ice for a number of months.
Yeah, clearly the culture's been broken. And in a lot of ways, Huss, it reeks a bit of, for too long, maybe the inmates were allowed to run the asylum, like to coin a phrase, and guys were maybe getting away with things. Guys weren't being held responsible for things. Leashes were really long, and it came back to kind of bite them. And now it's kind of rearing its ugly head. It's all bubbling to the surface, and it's not a good look, frankly, for the whole organization. One that I suspect, is causing no shortage of strife and probably embarrassment. We know this is an organization that prides itself on its brand, on its reputation. Well, right now that brand, that reputation has taken a significant hit, and much work remains to be done. But you're right. A guy like Blake Wheeler, at this point, he may have to reinvent himself a little bit. I suspect there's a bunch of players that are going to have to do that. And if it means, accepting slightly different roles, some of them, it might mean accepting a ticket out of town, right? Like, no stone should be left unturned. And the hard work in the offseason has probably only gotten harder of what's happened in this last 24 hours. But it should make for just, an absolutely fascinating, riveting few months of debate and discussion here till the puck drops again in October.
Turd Ferguson, let me in on the Stastny Ehlers text chain, please. Nicely done. Mike, before we go, we're going to hear some of the comments from Kevin Cheveldayoff that he had spoken just before we went on the air earlier today. But if you could, what did you take away from what Kevin Cheveldayoff had to say? There's been a lot of times where Chevy's come up and done some verbal manipulation and hasn't really said a lot. What did he say? What did you take away from it? And what can fans learn from what Kevin Cheveldayoff had for them this afternoon?
Well, we were reminded once again that he's the brother of a politician, because he certainly has that part down pat, where he says a lot but doesn't really say very much. I thought today, Huss, not to pat us collective media on the back, but I actually thought the questions today, I thought there were some really good, pointed, direct, important questions, that were thrown Kevin Cheveldayoff's way. And I think he tried his best, to give a little bit of insight without giving away too much. And so, I don't know that he revealed any state secrets today, and that's just not his style, and he's not about to change that, of course. I think, to me, we're kind of past the point now of the talk really is cheap around here. It really is. There's been a lot of talk. Actions will speak louder than words, and we'll see, I guess, what kind of actions Kevin Cheveldayoff and his staff have planned this summer. But they have their work cut out for them to not only repair the on-ice product, but repair the off-ice product. And I asked Kevin Cheveldayoff direct today, like, how much pressure are you feeling from your bosses to get this right? Because this team, this organization, they took a big hit. And Kevin Cheveldayoff conceded that there is a lot of pressure. They feel it. They're part of the community, and they recognize that that the situation today is a lot different than it was just a few years ago. So, again, no bombshells were dropped by him. I wasn't expecting any, but it was an interesting 30-minute or so session, that's for sure, just based on the nature of some of the questions coming his way. I think if you compare that to maybe other garbage bag days in the past, things were a little more direct today. I'll put it that way.
Mike McIntyre with this here. Hey, just one final one for you on the way out. And again, I think I asked you, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago when we were talking about this, as it became more and more apparent where this was heading. The chances of Mark Scheifele getting traded. And I think you said something like 60% or 65, and I was a little higher for that. And frankly, I was just couching it because I certainly thought that that's what they needed to do, but I wasn't sure, depending on what happened, whether they would do it. To me, the writing's on the wall right now. How do you see this playing out? How long do you think it takes? And assuming that Mark Scheifele is traded, what does that deal look like coming back for the Winnipeg Jets?
Yeah, I think.
And thoughts on the market for Scheifele too. Some people speculate that what happened yesterday damaged his trade value. I actually think the other way around. I think the talent market, like, it's not like this guy has. I mean, in this market, people have watched him, and maybe the opinion of Mark has gone down somewhat. I think it certainly has. But hey, his numbers and his results are the results. And if anything, I think there's maybe more general managers today thinking, maybe Mark Scheifele would look good on our team than it was before. So I'm actually not in the camp that, if anything, I think more people are talking about it, and the more people are interested, that might actually help a trade value of a key piece like 55.
Well, starting with the percentages, turn my 6 upside down and make it a 9. That's 90% is where I'd put the probability of a trade now. And I only give a 10% sort of window of not trading him. If that were to happen, Huss, there'd have to be some massive damage control, not only publicly, what he would say and what others would say, but my goodness, in that room. I think yesterday sealed his fate, frankly. But I also don't think that puts the Jets in a position where they're going to be taken to the cleaners by a team, because, again, this isn't a situation where Mark Scheifele is a UFA next summer, where the Jets are handcuffed now because teams know they have him over a barrel. The Jets have to move him or they risk losing him for nothing. No, he's signed for 2 more years. The Jets don't have to trade him immediately. And I think there would be a massive bidding war for a guy like Mark Scheifele for the reasons you just point out, Haas. This is a guy who, by all accounts, those of us who watched him, had a major off year. The engagement was perhaps at an all-time low at times from Mark Scheifele, and he still put up 70 points in 67 games. He would have been close to a 90-point player had he played a full season. He can still go. He's in the prime of his career, as he said himself yesterday. You don't believe it? Just ask him. He'll tell you. He's still a very good hockey player, and he's signed to a deal that would have other teams salivating. His price point is so reasonable. So, again, if you're the Jets, you're not trading Mark Scheifele for draft picks or top prospects. You need to get something or some things back that immediately can step in and help you win. And obviously that you can control, cost control and term control. But I do imagine that Mark Scheifele on the open market would create a heck of a bidding war. For that reason, I don't expect something to happen really quick. Is it at the draft? I don't think the draft has to be a deadline by any stretch of the imagination, because, again, I don't anticipate draft picks are part of a Mark Scheifele trade, because this isn't a rebuild that's going on where you'd then be, building for the future. But the draft, as we know, is where GMs are all under the same roof and a lot of business gets done. So, I would circle the draft in early July. I think it's the 7th and 8th this year in Montreal. But by no stretch of the imagination would I say it has to get done by then. I just think that that's when things might certainly heat up around Mark Scheifele.
Some people in the chat are saying, well, I mean, the Jets, Chevy doesn't rush into anything. They've got 2 years to trade him. I mean,
no.
There's no way you have
They
this
have
drag on into.
They have 4 months to trade him.
Yeah.
Again, if you're trading him, you're trading him before the season. You're not bringing that back into this situation. Absolutely. I mean, if the reason you're trading him is because of the whole situation, it's not because you're losing him next summer for nothing. If you're trading him, it's because the situation has become untenable, and so you got to move him sooner rather than later, aka before next season starts.
Well, this is why we've been discussing it all season long. The potential that even with a lost season at the deadline, it wasn't out of the question. Is
Right.
that the value of Mark Scheifele would have been at that point 3 playoffs in 2 more years.
Yeah.
The minute you wait into another season or another, I mean, regardless of what's happening here, and I think we've kind of laid it out that some significant changes need to happen, and that's probably at the top of the list. The other thing is, if then you're speaking about the value of the asset, the more time he's not with this new team, the less of a value is. So,
yep.
I think it's pretty clear where we go from here. You got anything to write about tomorrow in the Free Press?
Yeah, just a little bit. Jeff Hamilton and I have the team coverage in the paper tomorrow, and a couple more days probably of some Jets post-mortem stuff, and then be shifting to a whole bunch of other things here for the immediate future. Going to do some Moose coverage coming up. Of course, their playoff series starts Friday. Continue some Winnipeg Ice coverage. Got some Gold Eyes stuff coming up. Some golf, some Bombers, no shortage of action. And of course, we will continue to keep a wayward eye on the Jets throughout the offseason.
Yeah, something tells me there'll still be a few Jets columns coming up. I don't think it's going to be dull around this hockey club, despite the fact that the season is over. We've got to wait till next year. Mike, thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Huss. Enjoy the week.
There it is, Mike McIntyre of the Winnipeg Free Press.